Hey, what's up, internet friends? Welcome back to SIOAOA for another straightforward, no frills IT service management video. If IT service management or watching David Brent lookalikes is your thing, then subscribe to this channel and click the bell to be notified whenever there's new content available, which I apologise for the past couple of months, there hasn't been. I promise more to come more frequently in the future. So then, chances are, if you work in IT, especially in IT service management, you'll be familiar with a whole set of different processes that make up what you and your colleagues do on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And if you're familiar with frameworks like ITIL, which I bet most of you are, you'll know ITIL describes the purpose and the activities of these processes and what they're there to achieve. For example, incident management being, and I quote, the process responsible for managing the life cycle of all incidents. Incident management ensures that the normal service operation is restored as quickly as possible and the business impact is minimised. That said, between many of the organisations I've worked with in the past, there are always subtle, in fact sometimes not so subtle, differences in how these processes are carried out, be that individually or as a whole set. In some scenarios, businesses have optimised processes. In others, they are very ad hoc with a lack of definition. In fact, in some organisations, you may have one process at one end of the scale and others at the other end. So how does that happen, and what's the best way to overcome this? In today's video, I'm not going to be focusing on any specific process, but more so how you can make sure that you put the pro into the management of your processes. I'm Gareth, this is SIOAAA, let's do it. Now, think about the processes your IT function utilises. How did they get there? Why are they a thing? Now, unsurprisingly, processes don't just magic themselves up out of nothing. They don't just exist somewhere out there in the ether also. You know, at some point in time, somebody, no matter how well or effectively, designed, built and implemented that process for a very specific purpose. But as people come and go and ways of working change, it's not too uncommon that processes can sort of, get abandoned almost. You know, what do I mean by that? In the past where I've questioned teams that I've been working with, why is it that we do things in a certain way? The common phrase I hear is, well, that's the process. Follow that up with a couple of questions along the lines of, well, why is that? Or who do I speak to find out more? And it's at that point, occasionally there's a blank look staring back at me, a shrug of the shoulders, or sometimes worse, the guy that used to run this function who left the company a while back, they're not about anymore. First off, when it comes to managing processes, each and every process needs to have a dedicated, specific named owner. An obvious statement alert, that person is still employed by the company and is positioned as such to be able to take accountability that the process is able to meet its aims. Here's why. Processes are an asset to any IT function and thus the company to which it belongs. Just like the office furniture, just like the computers, the office itself. To be clear, what do we mean by asset? Well, let's use something straight out the glossary. Any resource or capability, anything that could contribute to the delivery of a service. Let's consider that the company you work for has a public-facing website, which allows your customer base to interact with your company. That website is an asset. Now, I'm guessing that your company has functions, teams, people assigned to make sure that the website remains operational, that it's updated, improved, meets the needs of those using it, and that it remains fit for purpose and fit for use. I bet there's also an individual within your organisation that is responsible for that website. I don't mean the technical service upon which it sits, but someone senior that can make the necessary calls about what goes on the website, sets the vision and direction for how the company intends to use the website, and so on. In that sense, the website has an owner. It doesn't mean that person and that person alone is the only one who has anything to do with the website, but they're the top dog when it comes to the site. Well, any organisation that has any processes that are well-defined, well-run, aligned to delivering positive business outcomes, I'll bet my bottom dollar that process or processes have defined owners. I worked at a company whereby problem management was a really well-mature, well-embedded, well-run process, and it didn't take too many conversations. In fact, I think it was the first one I had on the topic, where it was clear that that process had a defined owner. That person could describe to me in detail how the process worked, why we did it, how we measured success, and the activities they had planned to improve their process. One of the challenges they experienced, however, was that the interaction they had in those carrying out incident management activity. When we started to dig into this a little deeper, it was clear that the person spearheading problem management was struggling to engage the right or relevant people to make similar improvements in how our company was handling incidents. When I asked around who it was that owned incident management as a process, the responses I got were really varied. None of the people suggested to me, whilst involved to some degree in the management of incidents, categorically put their hand up as the owner of incident management. A few acknowledged they owned certain bits of the process, but no single owner could be found of the entire process. And there we had the root of the issue. With no focal point, no ownership, those involved in the incident process weren't provided with common vision, direction about how this company were to manage and track their incidents. More worryingly, without that key owner, decisions about how the process needed to evolve were either A, not defined or made, or B, even worse, like minute alterations to a specific part of the process were taken locally, not considering the rest of the process, or in fact inputs and outputs to other core processes. What that meant is that whilst the organisation had a process with no ownership, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to consider that end-to-end process to be managed. And if something isn't managed, it certainly isn't going to be maintained or improved over time. Most of my analogies seem to be automotive related, and this one is no different. Let's say your household has a car. It's functional, it works, but no one in the house is the defined owner of that car. Who's going to make sure or underwrite that that car is well looked after? Make sure it has its service, make sure it's MOT, tax insured. Well, those using the car may do bits and pieces here and there. For example, you're out driving and you might need to put some fuel in. But when it comes to those ownership responsibilities, well, I don't own the car, so that's not my job. What will happen eventually is that car will stop working, stop being fit for purpose, stop being fit for use. Now in the UK, the DVLA is the governance layer that ensures all vehicles on the road have a named owner. They make sure the owners of those millions of vehicles carry out the necessary activity to ensure those vehicles continue to be roadworthy. And if you don't, well, you can't use the car anymore. I'm sure you get the reference, but if you're in a CIO, IT director, head of service role, then consider yourself the equivalent of the DVLA. It's your role, as I'm sure you already know, to ensure that each of the processes that form part of your operating model have a designated process owner. Now, just like in the car ownership analogy, yes, being a process owner comes with certain responsibilities to ensure that, as I've said, the process remains able to meet its objectives and that asset is well looked after. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Okay, I know what you're thinking. I've already got enough work to do without a whole load of additional actions and responsibilities as a result of being a process owner. Well, okay, true, but kind of 2 points on that front. One, unmanaged processes are likely to be the cause of a lot of that unplanned work that comes across yours and your team's desks on a day-to-day basis. So taking ownership of a process and maturing that with clear consideration for things like technology, data, people, and the process itself can actually reduce that unplanned time-stealing activity that you experience. And point two, and you'll like this one, being the process owner doesn't mean having to do all the work. Good, right? In reality, how could the process owner be the person responsible for doing all the work associated to one process? Again, let's take incident as an example. Think about having just one person doing everything for all the incidents your IT team gets. Well, impossible. Instead, the process owner is there to be that leading voice, the authority, the sponsor that assures the process is meeting its necessary objectives. So a process owner's responsibility should encompass these sorts of things. Making sure that the strategy for the process is defined and painting a clear picture to those involved in the process of what optimal looks like. That the process is measurable and measured, that documentation is available, current and used, and that opportunities are identified for improvement, be that making it more efficient, more effective. Now, as well as process owners, there needs to be process managers. Their role in this is to make sure the process can be executed in line with what the process owner has laid out in front of them. There's no definitive hard or fast rules on these roles. It is very much dependent on the size and shape of your IT function. For example, it's entirely feasible for the process owner and manager to be the same person in a small function, much like there can be a process owner supported by a number of different process managers, maybe in a larger, more complex function. Again, let's consider incident management being owned by someone in and around the service desk. In a small service desk function of say 6 to 8 heads, it might make more practical sense for the service desk manager to be both the incident management, process owner and manager. In a large, complex managed service provider, you may expect the head of the service desk function to be the process owner and the individual service desk team leaders as the various process managers. Horses for courses. Now, in terms of the difference between process owners and managers, typically the manager layer is focusing more on ensuring that the process is being carried out as described, ensuring that the right resources are in place and assigned to be able to carry out the necessary activities and in the right way. Ultimately, however the ownership and management is structured in your organisation, what is essential is that the relevant people are assigned and that they and any stakeholder of the process are aware of their responsibilities, be that as owners or as managers. It sounds like a stupid question, doesn't it? But the process isn't just the method of carrying out a certain activity. Ready for another automotive analogy? Good, here's another one. Let's say that car we were talking about earlier, you decide to make a journey from Birmingham to London. How do you go about it and what's involved? Well, of course, you may want to do a quick search on maybe Google Maps to find the directions of how you get from where you are currently to your end destination, which will result in you achieving your desired outcome, i.e. being at your chosen destination. Then, of course, there's the specific steps involved in making that journey. Whilst the directions will lead you there, the act of driving the car against those directions and making sure you observe certain conditions and parameters is, of course, paramount. For example, the directions might lead you around a twisty, tricky road. You as the driver of the car need to know how to navigate that road. For example, it's unlikely you'll be doing that in 6th gear at top speed. Okay, so with the directions and the specific steps and instructions for each step of the directions, that's going to allow you to achieve your outcome. However, there are 2 other crucial parts in ensuring you do that successfully, repeatably and safely. There is, of course, the rules of the road. In this scenario, quite literally, the rules of the road, the highway code, which outline to you and other drivers also making journeys what you can and can't do. Imagine if these rules didn't exist. Is it more or less likely that you would be able to achieve the outcome that you're expecting? Well, less, of course. If some idiot is weaving all over the road, maybe they've had a drink, driving at top speed, bumping into you and other vehicles, of course that's going to impede you, even if what you are doing is very sensible and normal. Finally, it's not uncommon when driving along to maybe pass a policeman or go past a speed camera or a set of traffic lights. In this scenario, these are the factors that are governing how people are driving, making sure they stick within the guardrails provided and not causing chaos. If you're observed or measured going outside these guardrails, maybe doing 80 on a motorway, you may find yourself not being able to continue that journey or make future ones. These factors all apply to our IT service management processes. The directions for your journey to allow you to achieve your outcome, well, that is the process itself. The broad steps involved to get you from A to B, taking an input, your desire to get to London from Birmingham, and making an output, you arriving in London. The more detailed specific instructions on how to get from A to B, well, that's the procedure that those operating within the process need to carry out at each step of the process. The rules of the road, those are the specific process policies, what you or others must or must not do. And finally, the governance, that function ensuring that the process is being carried out accordingly. Let's apply that and for consistently, let's stick with incident management. So the process itself, that will describe the typical steps involved with the incident management process. Incident logging and categorization, resolution by first, resolution by second line, need to remember, monitoring and escalation, closure and evaluation. The procedure will describe which functions are doing what specifically at each of those steps. For example, at logging, ensuring what data is captured from the incident reporter, how tickets are categorised and prioritised, and then specifically where they're assigned to. And the process manager at this point is ensuring that this is being done accurately and optimally. The policy will or should state what all parties involved in the IM process must or must not do. And I find it useful for these to be categorised between the user or the customer base, the service management function, and the relevant service providers, resolving groups in this scenario. So your policy statements that the users, customers might say things like, you'll provide all necessary information to the IT service desk via available and agreed support channels. Sounds obvious, but this statement outlines to users if they have an incident and they want IT to do something about it, then the user must make sure they use the right channels and not expect IT to fix an incident if the user calls up their mate Jeff to tell them something's not working and Jeff works in marketing. Service management might have policy statements like service management should record all occurrences of incidents in the ITSM toolset. That way we're clearly outlining it's not acceptable for your IT service desk to be scribbling stuff down on post-it notes and passing them around. And for your service towers, that might say things like, they shall inform service management of an incident that has been assigned incorrectly. That way, if a ticket finds its way to the wrong place, it doesn't just stay there forever. Okay, and finally, the governance piece then. Well, that's the necessary activities you need to have in place to ensure the process is working as it should and being adhered to. In this scenario, you're going to have active mechanisms like assignment counts, breach and jeopardy reports to make sure those things flowing down the conveyor belt are doing so correctly in order to meet their outcomes. And you'll most likely have retrospective mechanisms like reviewing breach tickets, OLA, KPI, SLA reports, quality checks, compliments and complaints, all to make sure that the process is operative and where that can be improved over time. Now, where things like ITIL have helped us is that it gives us a broad framework for our processes, describing at that macro level the processes themselves, the inputs and outputs to other processes and key measures. What it doesn't tell us specifically are those explicit procedural steps, because they can be unique to a specific operation, function or toolset. When people talk about needing to change a process, I find it's normally the procedure that we're talking about rather than the process itself. Again, incident management example coming up, you're unlikely to want to change the process so that closure comes before logging, because that wouldn't work. But you may want to adjust the specific procedure at one of those phases to ensure that the way the process is carried out is more effective, safe, reliable, and so on. So to recap, policy, why we do something, the rules and the principles. Process, what we do and the series of actions. Procedure, how, specifically, when and with whom, specifically. Governance, the measures and controls. Some other things to remember when we think about our processes. Ultimately, processes exist and are driven to achieve the objective. Resolve that incident, implement that change, ensure services have appropriate capacity. They are all in response to a specific trigger, i.e. something breaking, someone needing to make a change, and they should always produce a specific result. And for me, most importantly, they are there so we can measure how and what we do, so that we can ensure that we're achieving those outcomes in line with what we're supposed to do, in terms of cost, duration, quality, and that we can always identify areas to improve. Okay, lastly then today, and that is around documentation. Perhaps it goes without saying, but your process, policies, procedures all need to be written down. They need to be reviewed regularly and they need to be accessible and available to anyone who may interact with that process now or at some point in the future. They are not well-guarded secrets only visible to those select few. They need to be out there, they need to be current, they need to be used. The process documentation also isn't just covering those 4 areas that we talked about. They need to include the objective of the process, why we have it and what it's there to do. It most definitely needs to cover also the scope, as in what's in scope and out of scope, when it's applicable and when it's not. Again, sticking with incidents, your IT incident management process is likely only going to cover IT incidents and not when something with a plug breaks in the office. It needs to outline the benefits of having such a process in place in terms of benefits to the organisation, financially, compliance, operationally, and to employees themselves. It should detail the specific roles and responsibilities for each function and area, ideally in a RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed structure. Also, what key performance indicators and key measures exist within the process, and what supporting data is required to evidence these and that the outcome is or isn't being achieved. It's important to include interfaces or handshakes, what exists between other service management processes. And finally, what meetings are required as part of the process, which, who are the attendees of those meetings, what are the agenda items, What's the point of the meeting? How often is it held? For example, in your change documentation, you're going to want to outline specifically what happens at the cab, who should attend, and so on. That sounds a lot, and it can be, but having this information well defined, well reviewed, instantly means your process is more mature than it was. It's no longer ad hoc. The challenge is then making sure this is well communicated, well implemented, and well maintained. And your processes are no longer some ethereal thing that just exist out in the IT atmosphere. Okay, I hope you found that useful. You too now can put the professional into your processes. Good luck. See you next time at SIOAOA.